Before there were movies, there was this. Paintings of great scale and chaos, the tiny figures swallowed by forces completely beyond their control. Now tell me, does that not remind you of a cinematic epic? The language of cinema, the dramatic lighting, the epic wide shot, the small human figure dwarfed by an enormous world, wasn't invented by filmmakers. It was invented by painters, centuries before a single frame of film was ever exposed. Some of those paintings were so staggering, so overwhelming in their scale and drama, that people paid tickets just to stand in front of a single one. Not a gallery, not an exhibition, a single painting. Today we're going to look back at some of the painters who essentially wrote the visual grammar of cinema, and we're going to start with a man who I'd argue is one of the most important filmmakers who never made a film. His name was John Martin. John Martin was born in Northumberland in 1789. By the 1820s, he was one of the most talked about artists in Britain, and when you see his paintings, it's immediately obvious why. Martin painted on enormous canvases. He painted biblical catastrophe, divine judgment, the fall of empires. His subjects weren't intimate portraits or quiet landscapes, they were the end of the world. In Belshazzar's Feast, painted in 1821, he depicts the moment that God delivers his judgment on the wall of King Belshazzar's palace. The tyrant king of Babylon reels as he learns his empire will fall before dawn. The architecture towers impossibly over the tiny, panicking crowd below. Light blazes from sources that defy physics. It looks less like a painting and more like a concept art render for a film that hasn't been made yet. But Martin wasn't just a great painter, he was a showman, a businessman, a proto-filmmaker in almost every sense. He didn't just hang his paintings on a wall and wait for critics to notice. He displayed them inside music halls and theatres, lit dramatically by gaslighting and accompanied by dramatic readings of the subject matter. He understood, before the word experience became a marketing buzzword, that you don't just look at a painting, you inhabit it. And the public responded, people queued, and when they saw the painting, they were moved and terrified. That's exactly what cinema does. So when D.W. Griffith, one of the founding fathers of cinema, built his legendary Babylon sets for Intolerance in 1916, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was lifting directly from Martin. The soaring columns, the impossible architecture, the sense of human insignificance against the built world, it's all there in Belshazzar's Feast, painted nearly a century earlier. Martin's shadow stretches much further than Griffith though. Look at Peter Jackson's vision of Middle-earth, the jagged peaks above Rivendell, the volcanic hellscape inside Mount Doom. Martin's painting, The Bard, and his illustrations for Paradise Lost, particularly Bridge Over Chaos, map almost directly onto what Jackson's production designers created for The Lord of the Rings. The approach is identical, an impossibly vast landscape with a solitary human figure that makes the world feel both real and mythic. Or consider the Jedi Council Chamber in Star Wars The Phantom Menace. Compare it with Martin's Satan in the Council from his Paradise Lost series. The circular geometry, the elevated figures, the theatrical sense of power and judgment. You start to wonder whether George Lucas's concept artists had an art history book open on their desks. Martin's formula was this: make the world so enormous that the human figure becomes a dot, and in doing so, make the audience feel something they almost never feel in their real lives. Awe, pure, unmediated awe. That's what the blockbuster has always been selling. Martin just got there first. But John Martin was dealing in epic scale. What about something more intimate? What about the way a single scene is lit? For that, we go back even further, to Rome in the early 1600s, to a painter who was, depending on your point of view, either a genius or a criminal, but probably both. Caravaggio. Caravaggio didn't paint pretty, he painted true. His figures aren't idealised, they're dirty, tired, wounded, mortal, and he lit them in a way that nobody had seen before. A single hard shaft of light cutting through a dark room. Everything not in that beam, pure shadow, nothing gradual, no comfortable mid-ground. The technique is called chiaroscuro, from the Italian for light dark, and Caravaggio wielded it like a weapon. Now fast forward to 1972. Francis Ford Coppola is making The Godfather. Cinematographer Gordon Willis, nicknamed the Prince of Darkness, makes a decision that should have been commercial suicide. He's going to keep half the faces of his characters in complete shadow. He's going to make a Hollywood blockbuster where you sometimes can't clearly see the protagonist's eyes. The result is one of the most visually arresting films ever made, and it's a direct line back to Caravaggio. The same logic, the same philosophy. Light doesn't just illuminate, it reveals. Shadow doesn't just hide, it implies. What you can't see is just as powerful as what you can. Martin Scorsese spoke openly about Caravaggio's influence on his own work, specifically how those bar sequences in Mean Streets were shaped by the idea of light as a moral indicator. The fluorescent red glow of the bar, the shadows pooling in corners. That's not just atmosphere. That's Caravaggio's theology applied to 1970s New York. And Kubrick pushed it even further. Barry Lyndon is famous for being shot entirely by candlelight, matching the actual luminance of 18th century interiors. But look at the composition of the frames. They're arranged like portrait paintings of the period, formal, almost static, the characters positioned exactly as they would be in a Gainsborough or Reynolds. The film doesn't just look like a painting, it's arguing that the lives of its characters were already fixed, already determined, the way subjects of portraits are fixed forever in a single posed moment. That's not just cinematography, that's philosophy expressed through light. There's one more painter worth looking at closely, Jean-Léon Gérôme, French academic painter of the 19th century, obsessed with historical accuracy and obsessed with the exact quality of light in ancient Rome, ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. His most famous painting, Police Verso, painted in 1872, shows a victorious gladiator standing over his defeated opponent as the crowd signals death with a downturned thumb. The crowd fills the upper half of the canvas. The sandy arena floor reflects the harsh Mediterranean sun. The defeated man is a small human detail in an enormous spectacle. When producer Douglas Wick bought that painting to Ridley Scott while developing Gladiator, Scott didn't say, "Interesting reference." He looked at it and essentially said, "That's the film. The composition, the atmosphere, the sense that individual lives are irrelevant against the machinery of Roman spectacle. It's all there in Jerome's canvas, already fully formed, 128 years before the film was released." What's striking about Jerome is how deliberately cinematic his thinking already was. He thought about narrative, about the precise moment to capture within a larger story, about what the viewer's eye should find first and where it should travel. These are the director's instincts applied to paint, which raises a question worth sitting with. We call films like Gladiator cinematic, and we call Kubrick's lighting cinematic. We even call Jackson's landscape cinematic. But the word cinema comes from the Greek for movement, kinema, and these paintings predate moving pictures entirely. So maybe the better question is, what are we actually talking about when we call something cinematic? Maybe we mean something older than film. Maybe we mean the impulse to create images that make people feel something too large for words. The impulse to hold a mirror up to human experience on a scale that takes your breath away. If that's what cinematic means, then Martin, Caravaggio and Gérôme were cinema. They just didn't know it yet. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Every director you admire has a visual education that goes far beyond the films they've watched. The great ones don't just study Kurosawa or Kubrick, they study Caravaggio and Turner. They pull books off library shelves at 3 in the morning and look at the paintings the way the rest of us look at reference frames. Because the fundamental challenge of filmmaking, how do you make someone feel something just by showing them an image, is not a new problem. It's not a 20th century problem, it's a human problem, and painters have been solving it for centuries. John Martin solved it with scale, Caravaggio solved it with light, Gérôme solved it with narrative precision. And when Ridley Scott looked at Police Verso, or when Peter Jackson imagined Mount Doom, or when Gordon Willis decided to leave Marlon Brando in shadow, they were standing on the shoulders of every painter who came before them. Cinema didn't invent the language of visual storytelling, it inherited it. So next time you watch a film and a shot hits you somewhere you can't quite explain, consider the possibility that what you're responding to isn't just good filmmaking. You might be responding to something that's been making people feel exactly that way for 400 years.